Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another database. It's been around a month and I've got enough time to discuss some new things. So let's kick off with one of the biggest that happened, I think 2 weeks ago now. It's just finished. And that was the big price cuts for the PlayStation 5. So we saw 70 to 80 pounds, $100 or more across everywhere. Even some contacts on Twitter told me that India, so effectively everywhere, was getting price cuts, big boosts. For Sony themselves, obviously, because the obvious drive here is get units shipped, and it signifies that PlayStation are looking to expand their market quite aggressively, whilst a new unit is on its way, which will have video evidence of showing the new case and the new model. The word slim is thrown around, but again, this points to the fact that the market expect it to be a slim. But really, again, this is kind of what I've said before in previous videos around the fact that this is all around maximizing profit margins and maximizing production values to getting more units into the market. There's no secret that Xbox aren't doing very well. They've done worse than ever, and their model has completely changed. And now with the Activision deal, I think this is one of the things I alluded to by be careful what you ask for, because this is now Sony doubling down, tripling down, going all out on their main market and reason to exist, which is to own the market. It's a different battle that Sony are going for compared to Microsoft, and this is kind of where they can attack, and I think this is where we're going to see it, and what we've just seen, in fact. So units I expect to be through the roof in terms of August, the end of this month. I expect it to be a high push in terms of market penetration for Sony. I don't know what the figures were, but I expect, I don't care, this is irrelevant. I don't know why people get obsessed about by companies selling units. You bought a PlayStation 5, other than your item continuing to exist, which is the only time you should care. And I remember, buying the Saturn and thinking, oh my God, it's doomed. And the Dreamcast was the last one. Throughout the years, you've got this kind of balance between, do you buy it, do you not? And then when you have bought it, you've got like buyer's remorse, which I think is one of the reasons that drives all the engagement online between Twitter and Xbox and PlayStation, and why people care about corporate sales. It's irrelevant. You shouldn't care. I don't care, but it's a good discussion piece, and certainly it's a lot of value I can add in terms of my understanding of it, because I work in it and have worked in it for many, many years. So again, what we're seeing here from Sony is it's a normal strategy. And when the first price cuts dropped, I surmised on Twitter, actually, I said largely this is going to be based on my experience in manufacturing and supply chain business for many a year. Fundamentally, when you ship international products, more specifically electronics, there's a ton of complexity that goes beyond the simple BOM and the storage costs of that unit. So there's things like bonded rates, import costs, consumer validation process, rework, QC, on and on and on. And what I stated on that tweet was that this is likely a combination of cleaning the supply chain, so remove the risk of sale or return deals, which is what most suppliers do. They don't actually own the unit, be that PS5, a TV, a Walkman, it doesn't really matter. It's actually on a lease, on a deal, normally referred to as in consignment, which many companies, this is how it works, because you can't buy 1 million units for Argos, for example, or Tesco, and just go, do you know what, I hope I sell those 1 million units. It doesn't work like that. So you kind of hedge your bets. There's a minimum order, there's a minimum sale, but there's a huge return, sale or no return. So that's very common practice, fundamentally. And what I stated on that tweet was that this is likely a combination of cleaning that supply chain out and obviously ensuring that they've got everything cleaned out from the warehouses, so there's no more consignments coming in. And when a new deal comes in, so when new items come in from a PlayStation, from Xbox, from Steam, whoever, when Valve, not Steam, when they bring a new unit to market, every deal changes. And then it's up to the consumer, effectively the retail store or the warehouse or the company, to decide what that deal is. And the more power you have, the better the price is. And that's a lot of the things happen with Sony taking back that power by selling digitally. So is Xbox. That's a shift in the market that's affected the retail chains, because they don't have those bricks and mortar stores, don't have the kind of power they used to have, and they could dictate that. How much shelf space costs you for a game or a unit and all that kind of stuff. That's why you saw a lot of the times back in the day, you saw bigger areas for Commodore, Spectrum, and then later on, the Amiga took up stores. And then when it came to consoles, it was a big battle between Nintendo, Sega, and Atari, basically fighting over what shelf they could get. And then later on, Saturn and Nintendo and PlayStation. So a lot of that work comes out around the fact that retail's had a lot of power. They don't have as much as they used to now. So when these kind of sales and return and new units come into effect, it means that it triggers some impact on current SKUs. So if you're sitting in that in consignment SKU that's in your warehouse and it's likely got an RRP on it, then a new unit coming in is going to have a reduction on that RRP. And that's what I expect. That's why we saw price cuts. I expect this unit to be drastically cheaper. And some of the impacts of why they raised their prices have changed. So this new process basically triggers that by some older SKUs can end up going back to source if you've still got them in the warehouse, which presents a cost to a manufacturer. So if you're Sony and you've got, let's say you've got 5 million units in the UK that are out there with suppliers, what you don't want is in 2 months' time or a month's time, probably around about now, they'll be shipping them to warehouses to get ready for the Christmas sales. You don't want to have any of those coming back to you because that's going to have a cost. Potential revenue stream that's now ceased. So you're no longer going to get paid for those units that you kind of forecast that you would at some point because they were sold, not sold through, but sold out to market. That's going to come back. That's going to hit you with a cost. And if it's coming internationally, it's got to go back to a warehouse, then there's all the shipping costs, the freight costs, and everything else that goes alongside that. So it actually presents quite a big impact to them, and it's a cost. So as such, as mad as it might sound, a price cut on the units that are out there means that retailers can pass that on because they get that revenue stream and they choose how they want to pass that on to the consumer, and then there'll be contracts and deals signed between the two of them. And all in all, it's a price saving. And it's a revenue boost because that means that Sony can call out and claim that sale. So that sold through rate is now there. They get paid for it. And some of that might have already been paid in previous deal, but it means they can cement it. They haven't got the risk now of that sunk cost. It's now got a revenue. There's no additional cost that could come back and hit them later on, which then affects their profit and loss. And adding to the benefits here, that return to source, the shipping, the freight, all those logistics, they're all gone. So they don't have that risk anymore, and they don't have to forecast for that potential expense. So that's a double, it's a double win for their finance team, and that just improves their market share, improves return on investment, and it means they've got more money in the pot for additional plans going forward, more R&D, more investment, buying new studios, whatever they're going to do with that money. This is what this is all about. So this is about growing the brand and taking revenue when you can. So they're striking while the iron is hot, as the saying goes. So as a new unit comes into retail chain that has been designed, as is always the case, to be a streamlined production-based version on lessons learned from the last couple of years. So there's the BOM reductions themselves, and more importantly, a single SKU. So they can now build a single PS5 and sell that as either a digital or a disc-based system with a split Blu-ray drive, which will make a huge reduction in their production process. And more importantly, it means their forecasting aspect is no longer quite as risky. They don't have to split between make me X amount of digital units and make me X amount of physical disc units. You just build what you have on back order. And then you have these drives separately that you can easily attach at the end of that process in manufacture, or even post-manufacture. When in situ warehouses, you can just put out a rework request, ship a stack of drives, and the rework teams will just attach those, and it's dead easy. So I'm assuming that disconnect is very, very simple. It might not be retail based, so it might not be a simple plug-in. You can buy a drive and click it in. I'll be surprised if it's not, but it doesn't mean it has to be, because I think the biggest benefit of this is the fact that they're cutting cost on that production cycle. That's one of the main areas, and it means they can streamline all of their production process, and like I say, they can get the best out of each of those production cycles. It means they can sell them either as a digital or as a physical and not really lose anything. They're just manufacturing a stack of discs they'll have in backlog in warehouse. So I'm not going to bore you anyway with the complexities of manufacturing, but all this is a good thing, as I would assume based on this, the internal component reduction, and even the currency and exchange rates, which have shifted since they increased the price, which affected everyone. The new cost reduced SKU will likely be the same price as those price reduced ones. My God, I can't speak, apologies. Price reduced ones are around $50, $80 or whatever, cheaper when it lands. So that will continue the revenue and market growth for Sony, because effectively what you'll have is people going, I can't get a PS5 now. Oh, look, a new unit's come out. It's slightly smaller. It's the same price. I'm not missing out, and I might get additional benefits for the packing game. I don't know. There's lots of choices they can do here, because it's all about making sure that they continue that momentum of getting more and more PS5s out in the market. And that kind of brings me to my next subject. So it is a new subject. The long-rumoured PS5 Pro, which has been around for a while, but it's kind of gained more traction recently when it appeared in Microsoft statements in that FTA Activision case. Now, The first thing is although corporate espionage is a real thing, don't get me wrong, it is, and it has been for decades and decades. Microsoft cannot really know this other than if something is within R&D, which is always kind of the case anyway. That doesn't make any difference. That's never not been a product. It's never not been an issue in terms of delivering products. It doesn't mean it's going to make a commercial product, though, let alone any feasibility or wider testing of that. Companies will constantly always be in R&D. That's why you always see on the profit and loss at the end of the year how much they spend in that. And they write that off. That's just kind of a sunk cost. You spend it, you allocate a budget, teams go and shout and say, oh, well, I've got this really great idea. I want to turn our current cloud system into an app that runs on a phone and you can whatever. So I know all this when we do. So you get a budget, you go and spend it. That budget has no ROI on it. It's just go and see if you can prove this project, a proof of concept, a POC. If it works, great, we can turn it into a viable product. If not, it's just R&D, and that happens all the time. So there's definitely a PS5 Pro, as there is, a Switch 2 from development or Xbox Series XX225, whatever, always going on. That's just always the case. It's whether or not that becomes a viable product and whether it means anything. So they'll take all that all the time. But the thing about the statement from Microsoft and what came out is it only really helps Microsoft anyway within that document. If you think about it, Sony wouldn't want that out in the open if it was true anyway. And for Microsoft, it just kind of reinforces the whole, whoa, woe is me, poor weak Microsoft, we can't compete with big bad Sony, which was, let's be honest, a joke. Nothing could be further from the truth. But playing the victim is a known tactic at times. It always has been. It's becoming more prevalent of late, but it's certainly not an unknown to do that, especially in the corporate area. And even Sony did it a bit with the drama of the PlayStation is dead without COD. So corporate dramatics aside, we need to look at the rumour itself and what it does for both parties. So for Microsoft, it helps them, as I say. So if they're behind PlayStation, then a new console makes no sense, whereas Sony can kind of push on with an even better, more powerful machine as they're the king of the console space. They know it will sell, people will buy it, and it just makes Microsoft look even weaker. So that's the first reason why they've done it. The second one is, in addition to this, it creates a kind of doubt in current or impending PlayStation buyers with the, I'm going to wait and see now, or anger maybe if you've just bought one and you think, hang on a minute, I've just bought a PlayStation 5 and now you're going to release a Pro and it could be the same price, and you get all that FOMO that it kills and drives people's mindsets, sadly, at the moment. And then finally, it also creates developer confusion with the, not another SKU, just like Microsoft have. And they might be developers that actually have quite a good relationship with Sony, and they're like, hang on a minute, I didn't hear anything about this. Is Sony keeping this from me? How does Microsoft know and I don't? And it can create bad tension. So if you look at it from the Microsoft perspective, there's lots of benefits and more of why that would make sense to be in that document. Intentional or unintentional. But for Sony, it's all negative, really. It's because even if it's true, which I'm pretty sure if it was true or wasn't true, they would not want that coming from inside the house. And this kind of brings me to my main point, and I think many are really missing, and that is the same thing I've said over and over again, and I said over on Moore's Law is Dead podcast last year. I simply cannot see the benefit a PS5 Pro makes for Sony or the market, aside maybe kind of selling 8K TVs and getting to that level. It won't be really 8K anyway, or achieving a genuine 4K on more titles. That's kind of the only area I could see it working. But most people don't care, and the market, as by and large, doesn't care that if it's a true 8K or an 800p or a 1440p upscale. No one cares. If it looks sharp and clean, they're going to buy the TV. So it doesn't really matter. And in reality, the PS5 has so much potential yet untapped that all the Pro will offer is really that higher resolution, higher FPS, and possibly potentially better ray tracing, which is one area I think they could make the biggest strides. I think that's the one area they could try and get closer to NVIDIA. So there's definitely some benefits, but not enough for the costs it will bring. Again, brings me back to more SKUs, complexity in the market, confusing consumers, confusing developers. All of that kind of brings a lot of negatives to them, and I don't think there's much benefit of it. It certainly doesn't make as much sense as the Pro did, and let's be honest, the Pro didn't do as well. And it wasn't even a unit, what was it, 1 in 5? And there was a great response on one of my patrons that gave me, which I'll flash on screen now. He did a really good detailed breakdown of his views on it a few months ago, and I thought it was very insightful. It was good, so I do appreciate that. Thank you very much for sending that in. And I think that This is the point around a pro console only makes sense if you're a hardcore sitting on the edge of the hardcore. It doesn't make sense if you're just one of those people that says, do you know what? I like PlayStation. I love their games. And what can I get that I can play games on? A PS5. There you go. It's slightly cheaper. A PS5 Pro at 600 quid. It's not going to sell gangbusters, I don't think, because the value return on that investment isn't there. And it's a hard sell. That's my point. 4K machine versus a 4K machine with slightly better resolution and slightly better ray tracing. It just doesn't feel like something that would sell loads. And you only got to look at the high-end PC market to see that they're dying and they're shrinking. And that's why you're getting a lot of cards. And like I say, even NVIDIA pulling out and stopping development of 40 cards and just almost giving up on the high end because medium and mid-range is where it's at. And that kind of brings me back to my main point. Sorry, I'm trying to add a lot of value to this, but probably waffling a little bit. So if you look back at development and generations since year dot, any established piece of hardware is superseded. And if you continue to sell that same spec of machine, you kind of have two ways to deliver that. You either buy sufficient parts and then provide them for the intended lifespan of your product, which is highly unlikely and almost impossible in this current climate, or you continue to buy them from the supplier. And the thing is, in the current high demand and profiling fab that factories do now, in terms of their actual wafers, the chips, the memory, what's in the pipe, what's not in the pipe, basically the mold process in terms of manufacturing, you can't always have every single model you make available on the conveyor belt. You've got to pick and choose. So if it's not on the conveyor belt, there's a huge motivation cost. It's that momentum that you need to get things moving. It's like retail and logistics. If you stop the chain for a week, the knock-on effect can be months because you're stopping that momentum, that efficiencies. So that's the same when it comes to fabricating products and certainly in electronic supply. So what you'll end up with is them having to go to that supplier, whoever that might be, so in this case AMD, and in the current kind of let's all get our demands in place, the high demand and the profiling that these factories do means the wafer, the chips, the memory that all went into the PS5 in 2019, 2020 when it launched, they don't exist now, or at least they're not cost effective to use. The nodes have changed, the size of those, the nanometers reduced, there's different wafers, you get more out of them, and there's different units. They've moved on significantly in many areas. So as such, you either change the model, you stop selling it, or you adapt. And this has always been the case. The PlayStation 5, for example, had a very complicated and expensive, joint deal with Toshiba, IBM, and Sony around the cell chip. But the launch PS3 was on a 90 nanometer chip. And then when the PS3 Slim launched, it had halved to a 45 nanometer node. And even the RSX NVIDIA GPU in it dropped from 90 to 28 during its lifespan. And the savings here meant that the company could reduce cost, power, and heat, hence the Slim. And they could have also just bumped up the cores, the clocks, the performance, a la the PS4 Pro. And the same is true for the older 8-bit computers. The Amiga 500 itself was just a cost and size reduced version of the Amiga 1000 2 years prior. But the chips inside were slightly better in some areas, but were designed to be compatible and not overperform. And sometimes, though, you have to do this because the compatibility layer can be hardware or software. And as you have the two instances of where the kind of internal chips are far more powerful than in the later models than they were in the previous ones, you either gate or cycle control those to maintain 100% compatibility and performance levels with the target older spec. Memory, for example, is notorious for this. They downclock memory in newer hardware to match the older speeds, but the memory is far more capable. So you could even get GDDR5 now. It's GDDR6 and 6X. So all of those are way above what the older cards and the older consoles can power. So they just downclock them. And that's what they do. It's cheaper to buy more powerful and downclock it than it is to try and get older ones. So that's what I mean. And that's not new. GPUs do that forever. It's not just happened forever. Even the Switch, for example, the launch Switch model has a far, far slower CPU, GPU memory than the later models with the OLED. They've got far faster Samsung DDR nodes that are essentially downclocked to match the older maximum, but can be easily overclocked significantly over those old base speeds, which you can see from some games here going from 30 to 60 as the machine is severely bandwidth bound, something I discussed actually when it was launched in my Zelda Breath of the Wild review and my testing back then. But even the Tegra itself in the Switch is artificially limited in the launch model below its own base specs, likely for cheaper cost production from NVIDIA because of the lower yields on the chips and da-da-da-da-da. But you can again overclock that CPU and GPU beyond normal to see the headroom available in it. And again, the same is true for consoles, computers, phones, and anything else over the years. It's done for ease and cost, and realistically, as a manufacturing process, because it's just too complicated to try and match it. You just software manage it and downclock it and get it out the door. Me, as a manufacturer, be it Sony or whomever, I want to sell my product for a high demand console as much as I can. And all I care about is the internal components meet the baseline I need for that launch model, because that's what my target is. Not going above it, just at least meeting it. And I want to get the best price for that. So what does this mean in reality? Well, it means that in regard to the rumoured 60 CU chip for the Pro, or the PS5 Pro, that's kind of come out, and again, a lot of these things are always based on some element of truth. Well, these are all purchased within that AMD agreed plan. And the old PS5 had a 40 CU chip, as is likely the same spec as the 6700 40 CU chip, just with 4 cores disabled. In software, hardware, for yields and those cost targets, as I say, the binning process, as it is called, which is the same as the full spec 8 XT mode, which has the all 40 enabled, and they're the best of the lot. So they use those for the XT, and the ones that fail get knocked down to the base model, the 6700. Now, they'll no longer be in manufacture, as the 6000 series has been replaced with the 7000 series. And as you will see, the 7000 series does not have a comparable spec die for die for that 36 or 40 CU unit. The closest they actually have is that 76 unit, which only delivers 32 CUs, or the far bigger 7900 at 80. However, the 7800 is on its way, and it's coming in around 17% faster based on the linked benchmarks. We can assume this is little more than a refined 6800 die for the new 7800 range. And guess how many CUs that had? Correct, 60, which, well, has. So it's based on AMD's own power levels, is likely the exact same node chip, just using more power, likely on a slightly smaller node, taking that 6900 versus the 7900, for example. We can go from a 300 watt in the older card to a 315 watt in the newer one, and a reduction in infinity cache size. So a 5% power boost, increased clocks, smaller node, is likely doing all the lifting in that 17% theoretical performance hike. So my assumption is, for all the reasons I just noted, Sony have a great deal on a stack of these unsold 6800s, or likely the improved 7800 60 CU GPU nodes that fail within that target they've got. So the yield's pretty poor, might only be 50, might be 55. They don't care. They just want the 36, which they all hit. So they will now power the new slim model. I'm using that in quotes because it doesn't look slim, slightly smaller, but again, it's all about cost efficiency. They'll stick that in the new slim model, and the hardware and or software limit that to match the previous 36 CUs of the launch model. And then they'll gain the benefit on reduced power, cheaper PSU overall. The cooling is reduced significantly, which has been one of their main targets because it's a big part of their cost and their BOM. And then more, which means a tiny increase on the chip bulk price, likely, but maybe not. That could be actually the same price or slightly better than before, but that's more than offset by the unit reductions elsewhere in that manufacturing process. And this is where that 60 CU info is coming from, because it's likely somewhere within the pipeline, as it always is. Somebody's manufacturing these, and therefore they've leaked it and said this is for a PS5 because I've seen the documents and da. And again, it means no new news here, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid. What we have is Chinese whispers in effect. Some truth becomes a story that is likely not completely true, but it is backed up by kind of some level of truth. And again, I've spoken to some developer contacts I've got, and it's by far, it's not an exhaustive or even realistic gauge of any of this, but they are either very good at keeping 100% stum behind closed doors of what they genuinely know, or they genuinely know nothing of the potential PS5 Pro, because none of them had any idea about it. Now, that said, with Sony's SDK, it would likely be the same as the PS4 Pro, in that all you get really is a boosted performance level using your current code, and it should really only be a testing edition and QC element rather than any extra development. So aside what many may have been saying online and the rumblings from Microsoft's own direct links, and I may yet be proven wrong on this, of course, because I don't know, I suspect we will not see a PS5 Pro this year, next year, or even the year beyond potentially. But that is not to say that it cannot be seen and cannot have some potential reasons to exist, and positive ones, as I mentioned before, for Sony. But I'll cover that in a later video, maybe, I think. Realistically, though, I think what you're going to see is that 60 CU is what's inside this new box on a reduced node, and that's going to be a significant improvement on cost and performance. That's that. What's next on the docket? Forza. Yeah, so on Forza, there's been an update on the launch of new information. It's kind of bad news again for Forza, and certainly for Xbox fans. And I'm trying to abstain from blaming this on the Game Pass model, but this is exactly the kind of thing I mean when I say the GP model is a race to the bottom on quality, and it continues kind of Microsoft's lacking in largely downright terrible first-party output over the past couple of years. In a recent developer podcast, they announced that the game is now a live service with a new multiplayer mode being expected. Obviously, you need that to be online. That makes perfect sense. But the career mode will now also be online, and I quote the Isaki, I think he said here. So the game has been designed to easily adjust and add content over time. It's really to ensure a fair and secure experience anywhere in the game. So any progression in the game will be stored in our service to support the integrity of the overall game experience. There are options for playing offline, so things like free play are always available, but any progression requires an online connection. Now, this was a pain for me in GT7. I'm not a fan of it, and I moaned about it when that went down, I believe, for 2 or 3 days or so around launch, and I wasn't happy because it kicked me out, and I just kind of gave up for a week because it annoyed me. But again, this is it. This is along with split screen also being removed and possibly, in quotes, added later. It probably won't be, and it's likely linked to the exact same Series S parity issue I mentioned last time around Baldur's Gate 3, which you can check out my IGN review for more on that area, where I covered the kind of the potential issues it's having using PC and Steam Deck. But it means that Microsoft aim for low entry of consoles. A subscription model leads to these decisions. So where incomplete models and games can be tracked, and then if the game does pick up enough interest, then the development teams are extended and they're given new stuff to make. And I hate this big push to online everything, as it's really just data collection and control. The statement about fair and secure progression is essentially Microsoft have always found career progression dodgy. That's what they're saying. They're going, do you know what? Before this game, career progression was dodgy and unsafe prior to this title, which is a classic marketing lie, telling you the new shiny thing we're selling you now is most certainly better than the last one, and it's all good for you, and it's not bad at all, and it's all in your interest, not in ours. Trust me, bro. Utter rubbish. It reinforces my view of GP as destructive in both the developer space but also the consumer and quality space. Starfield is going to have even bigger weight on its shoulders now for Xbox next month. I am buzzing for that game, so I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a cracking game. Like I said before, my concerns around performance and issues, they still are there. But realistically, if it ticks the boxes of No Man's Sky, with a very strong artistic-driven story element, and with lots of, the ship bit really gets me interested in building your own ship and everything else. But I'm buzzing for that. And as it stands for Forza, it's kind of not that bad a hit because of Starfield. But if Starfield wasn't there, this is kind of your big ticket item for the year. So again, you've got to look at these things outside of the bubble we're in, and Xbox need to sort that out. They really do. Continuing on the Xbox theme, there are some good news. So Xbox actually signed a deal with Square Enix to bring more games to the Xbox console, so Series X, Series S, which is great. They were at a Japanese conference with Square, and it's obviously very positive news. Square are now working directly with Microsoft to get those games onto Xbox, and this likely means Games Pass. I can't see any other way that they mean it. So when they say Xbox now, they mean Game Pass. The console's irrelevant. I said that years ago, actually, 2017. In fact, go back and check out my review. I did see this coming from Microsoft a long way out with the Xbox One, that this was their target. And this is it. This is the aim of becoming a publisher and getting out of the hardware game, effectively. But every silver lining in every cloud and all that. So Final Fantasy XIV is the first big one with a 2024 release, they've said, on Series S and Series X, with the latter being 4K, which is great. And the game, although not really my thing, I'm not a fan of it, it doesn't really float my boat. It's a welcome boost for both Square and Xbox, as the port will be much, much cheaper, and hopefully, within that online-based element that it has, it will make more sense on Game Pass, and it could be a win-win for both parties. And it could also signify that we'll see some previous timed exclusives landing on Xbox. So Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1 It's about to get its next entry next year, I think, for PS5. And they could look to port the first episode to Xbox. And obviously the stunning 16, which we got as a timed exclusive recently on PlayStation 5, a PC version is likely only just starting development. It's probably in that right now. Once the time window on that exclusivity lapses, within the deal itself, whatever that is, a year normally, but could be more, I don't know, then an Xbox version could be little more than a tweaked PC port for both consoles. Again, I expect big cuts on the Series S, as it is a very demanding game, even on the PS5, as I covered in my reviews. So that's another title that could make big impact on Xbox, and obviously just, you know, add that little more into the coffers for Square Enix, and they need that ROI. Every time they release a game, they tell us that it's good, it's bad, it's indifferent. The question around timed exclusive, though, is not a new one, and it's a tale as old as Atari, Nintendo, and Coleco, truth be told. I'm not a fan, let's be clear. I understand that they exist for a variety of reasons, and in many cases, you may not have actually seen a game at all, were it not for a direct platform support, such as Shenmue 3, Metal Gear Solid 1 on the PlayStation 1. They were all timed exclusives, and it did a good job for PlayStation by, you know, locking Metal Gear to a PlayStation View, even though it appeared on the MSX and the Nintendo Famicom years before that, but that's by the by. And kind of amongst other things, VR is a classic case where this kind of limited support element works for both parties, and specifically the players, us. So let's be honest and say that they all do it. They'll all continue to do it. Rise of the Tomb Raider was a huge Xbox One exclusive that hit PlayStation over a year later. And even recently, we had things like Scorn and High on Life, which were also not even allowed to say they were coming to PlayStation 5. There was one coming and even existed until the day or a day before it came out. So that it didn't harm Xbox themselves, and that benefit was consistent right up to the point where it landed on PlayStation. So, like I say, all of them exist for the same reason, and white knighting one over the other without any caveat, doesn't matter what it is. Yeah, but Xbox put their games on PC. That's just hypocritical. It doesn't make any difference. It's about Game Pass, like I say, not Xbox. So if this was not to incentivize Xbox and Game Pass and add value to that, and at the cost of PlayStation, then you're just lying to yourself. And if you believe what they're saying, then you believe in their lies. Just as it is the other way around, with titles like Final Fantasy 16, Stray, and even upcoming Xbox exclusives in Stalker 2 and Stellar Blade for the PlayStation 5. It makes sense. None are better or worse than the other, and it's always been a thing to kind of deal with it, move on. So long as they're all available offline and in a physical disc format, I'm happy, and I'm not going to get wound up by it. But I'm well aware that I'm in a privileged position because I have every machine, PC, console. So I'm well aware that's the case. So I understand people's personal anger at it, but you can't really say Xbox doing it is fine, PlayStation doing it is not, or other way around. They're both as bad or as good as each other, depending which way you view it. Beta updates. Yes, Dolby Atmos. Interesting one, this. Very interesting. So yeah, PlayStation continue to add value. I think it's good. And adding value for us audiophiles with Dolby Atmos support, complementing its currently superb 3D audio. And it all works natively with the PS5 dedicated Tempest audio blocks. And it's likely as good as any other device, I suspect. You know, I've not tested it. So the key word in the blog, though, is supported via HDMI devices. And as per my VRR coverage, your mileage may vary. So that doesn't mean it will support every Dolby Atmos HDMI device. So just be aware of that. But I don't own a Dolby Atmos surround sound system. My TV supports it, and I've got a decent LG 5.1 surround sound system, which, although great, it does not support the full height 7.1.4 Atmos level, although my amp separately could. So I could add extra speakers to that and then test it that way, but I don't have a Dolby Atmos setup. I've just got a 5.1, which is great, don't get me wrong. And I use headphones a lot of the time because the family and everyone in the room, it kind of makes more sense. And the 3D audio I love anyway. So the reason Sony have added this over time, though, is likely due to the growing soundbars and devices and TVs that support Atmos, including Sony's own. And many of these can be added later on with extra speakers, be they wired or wirelessly. And due to the way PlayStation 5 is kind of designed, their architecture is very bespoke and all their elements are bespoke. They can improve and add options via software later on, just as you saw with the PS4 getting HDR post-launch. Because they use like a man-in-the-middle output of the console, not conform to a standard off-the-shelf HDMI port directly, something which Xbox did. The Xbox One couldn't support that, and they actually had to launch a new console to offer HDR, if you remember, the Xbox One S. So Here, the hardware-focused and efficient Tempest dedicated core means the same 3D sound processing and that head-related transfer function, so HRTRS. Obviously, in the PlayStation 5's operating system, you can set all that up. You can, adjust the 7.1 and the 5.1 systems. You can take a mapping of your ears. You can adjust it all. And it even works on standard stereo speakers, and it's pretty good. It makes it a little bit tinny, and it's certainly no replacement for proper surround sound, but it's an option, and it's better than just standard, stereo. It does work. It is good, and it's tangible. 3D headphones, they work beautiful as well. So the Tempest 3D audio can be used natively within the console to output a full Atmos 7.1.4 sound using, I think it's 36 channels, which effectively is taking the 3D objects that Atmos uses. So it kind of defines objects within the 3D space as an object and a source and a position. And cinema's the best place to hear it. If you go to cinema and listen to a Dolby Atmos a mix, it sounds incredible, but you're surrounded by like 60 something speakers, so it is the best way to hear it, and it's the highest level. You're not going to get that in your house. And obviously here on the PS5, I think it's limited to that 36 channels. And I actually saw, just today, I saw that Sony released a statement to Digital Foundry. I think that what kicked that off was they were discussing it the week earlier, and they guessed that it was actually a container that emulated Atmos, which is obviously incorrect. And that's likely actually why Sony, the PR team, got in contact, because this is very, very important for companies. And this is what happens. They reach out because that information negatively affects the Atmos update and the PlayStation 5 quality overall, because it's incorrect. And Digital Foundry have a lot of reach, so therefore when they say something, even though they were just surmising and theorising what it might be, people take that as gospel incorrectly, because you should never do that. You should always take it from a mixture of, companies will tell you something, they'll say it's 4K, and then I'll pixel count it, or they will, or somebody will, and you go, oh, actually it's not 4K, it's 1440p upscale. So that's what I mean. There's the truth in there, so you have to take both sides of the fence. Mistakes get made, specifically when you're guessing at how something works without actually knowing anything about it and understanding the concept. It's only just come out, they're having a conversation. I know it was on I think one of their videos on technology or the blog thing, but the long and short of it is, when you read the article it's on Eurogamer, the link is below, you can see that the dedicated hardware and programmable nature of the SPUs, that Tempest block, as I say, and Sony did all this discussion, which I covered actually on my original PS5 Road to PS5 video. The sound channels are really just processing that based on the origin locality within the game. So again, it's very similar to 3D objects as Dolby Atmos does, but what they do here is they just basically take that and they kind of use a relevant bias of where the speaker is in your house and lean it up or down. So that's how 3D audio works. It kind of emulates sound source, and this will likely how it works, and it will really benefit many games that now have Atmos high editions added in them. But it's really going to benefit when people go back and remix something. So you can certainly run a game now that supports it, and it kind of forces it into that category, but it's not going to make that much of a difference, I assume, because the information, if it's not there at source, then the Tempest audio can only do what it's given. So it can only kind of push things into a sound space based on what information is already in there. So it's a welcome boost nonetheless, and I'm actually happy that DF did this guesswork at the solution, albeit incorrectly, but it's always a risk when you're doing this kind of surmising on things, because it promoted Mark Cerny and Sony to reach out to them and give a more detailed and insightful statement, which is something I enjoy. I wish we saw more of it, and I wish I could get more of it directly, and so yeah, thumbs up. No negatives there for Digital Foundry. That's just one of the things that happens when you're in the edge of technology and you surmise things. There's no harm done, no harm, no foul. We got more information from Sony, which is a win-win. And obviously, in addition to this, they've also added some other benefits to the beta as well. You've now got 8 terabyte SSD support, which is great for those with big demands and even deeper pockets. And they've also updated, the baseline speeds are the same, so you still need the same bare minimum of that 8 terabyte drive, so it's still going to cost you a few quid if you're going to go to 8 terabytes, but it's welcome nonetheless to get that kind of space and save all that uninstalling and shifting of data, which I do as well. And they've turned off the PlayStation beep, which is sacrilege, let's be honest. An option to turn that off. It's probably for those people that like to play in their bedroom when their other half is fast asleep next to them and they don't want to wake them at 2 a.m. in the morning when they're just trying to turn the console off and it goes beep, and you're like, what are you doing? And we've all been there, we've all done that. I see the reason, Sony. Next one, final one, I think. So the impending Switch 2. We all knew it was coming. It's been long since known that it's going to come round, and it should be this time next year, actually. I'm sure we'll have all the info and release date and everything else. So I discussed this many years ago, actually, on Red Gaming Tech site with ex-PS5 engineer Matt Hargett. And we kind of all surmised it would be an updated version of the Tegra chip. And it will stay within ARM and an NVIDIA partnered APU. It'll use DLSS, and all that kind of info has kind of been out for a while. Some of my developer contacts have said that SDK updates are planned. No one said they've got anything yet, though. But again, it's very limited pool that I can speak to. But realistically, it's looking like the Tegra 239 SoC is almost certainly going to be the core of it, which is fundamentally, I think it's the Orin. I'm just looking at my notes. What did I put? My writing's terrible. I still use pen and paper, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, the Orin. So the Orin is kind of going to be the heart of it. I've got some suspicions on where that will sit and what that will do. And CPU-wise, if it does use all 8 cores with a clock speed boost as well to 2 gigahertz, then I could see that more than doubling real-world performance based on the base Switch now, which would really be needed to ensure that current-gen games, at least, can go to the Switch without any huge cuts and changes, because that's a big area, and RISC-based updates and compiler efforts within the SDK obviously will play a big part in that. But I think on this score, the RISC is better suited to games anyway than x86. I've said this before, and the new hybrid should be able to compete in CPU-demanding titles with the Steam Deck, the Rock, and other handheld devices. So I don't think there's any massive concerns there. There'll certainly be cutbacks in terms of areas that will happen on both CPU and GPU and everything else, but I think it'll be pretty good. But before I get into it, and I'll have another video on this going into it, the thing that people need to remember and keep their expectations in check. So this is ampere based, so it's a expect the bottom end of the mobile RTX 30 range. But like all mobile devices, it's going to be very power constrained. So drop in resolution, using reconstruction techniques, it's all vital for battery life, performance, heat, and overall TDP. That's one of the main aims. And the Switch, Nintendo as a whole, literally since the Game Boy, they always prioritise usability, and the Game Boy dominated in large part in the late 80s, early 90s due to its incredibly frugal battery life, just lasted forever compared to the Game Gear, which was its own real competition. I know that the Lynx was out, but that was just bonkers mad and just didn't work out for Atari. They again tried to hedge their bets on too many things, but the Switch can last for hours on handheld mode due to the intelligent cuts made within its lithium battery, and 15 watts in thinking docked and 8-ish watts in handheld mode, which is pretty good. And anyone who's used the Steam Deck, as great as it is, and I love my Steam Deck, in its full 15 watt power mode, with its monstrous battery relatively, you're getting about an hour and 20 on demanding games. And the GPU is consuming like 70% of that power. So power use and battery alongside heat are a core aspect of the design, and it needs to be factored into everyone's expectations of the console. But I'm not going to go into that here. Just want to kind of highlight that I've got something coming up on that based on some information and bits and bobs I've been looking at for a while. So stay tuned. Retro news, my new thing. So retro news. So 40 years ago this month, let's go back to the 80s. The very first Laserdisc arcade game launched in Europe. So Astron Belt. It beat the most famous Dragon's Lair by a few months, except in America where it was delayed for a few bug fixes, I think, allowing Don Bluth's title to steal the awards over the pond and the accolades in terms of that first Laserdisc to hit the arcades. And obviously Dragon's Lair went on to be quite infamous and famous in terms of pushing graphics across every piece of hardware, specifically the Amiga. It was a big demo on the Amiga, and then the game which pushed visual quality on the Amiga, which blew people's minds at the time. I remember it quite well. It was also the start of the US-centric home video game crash. 1983. Everyone blames Atari, everyone blames ET, but it affected everyone. It wasn't just everyone's fault. It was completely US-centric, like I say, totally really affected them, didn't really affect anyone else. Certainly Europe, we weren't really affected by it because we weren't into consoles. Wasn't that big a thing. We'd moved to computers already a few years prior. But Coleco, Atari were affected. Long-standing third party, the longest-standing third party in Activision. They lost a fortune, amongst others, actually, overnight, as the business itself went from, $3 billion at the end of 1983 to a pittance of that, $100,000, less than 2 years later. I mean, that's huge. But the US recovery route from this was launching in Japan at the time with Nintendo's Famicom, same year, 1983, 40 years ago. And they were actually about to capture the Japanese homes on the back of that Game & Watch success they've been having. So it kind of later helped America fall back in love with consoles all over again, and that was thanks to Japan and the Nintendo Famicom. So yeah, 40 years ago they saved the industry in America. Again, not in their own space because it wasn't really a problem in Japan. Over here in the UK, we were booming anyway, and we were eating well on both hardware and software. Ultimate, later known as Rare, Ultimate the game, they launched their very first game this year, 40 years ago, round about this month, I think, give or take, Jetpack, as you see here on the Specky and the VIC-20. And then later on the BBC Micro, and that was a stonking success. Superb game, really enjoyable, very impressive as well for a first title. And it was really that beginnings of what 8-bits could do, platformers, shoot 'em ups, merging of different ideas from arcades like Defender, Thrust, all of those kind of games mixed into this and many others. And that's what I loved about the 8-bit era. There was just so many ideas and there was no rules. Shouldn't be rules when you're making things like this creative. It should just be what it is. There was the cut down BBC Micro from the ARM creators themselves, Acorn. That launched this year. The Electron, well, it kind of launched. It's a machine that kind of missed out on the Xmas rush, really, because it had that ULA issue. They kind of condensed everything down to this logic gate to try and minimise cost. That was their big thing, and they had some big issues with that, some major problems getting it to work. So it didn't actually come out properly until early 84. But it's still a personal favourite machine of mine due to the BBC games I used to play on that. Many of them at school, actually. So Chucky Egg, Citadel, Elite. I loved all of those games. And the BBC Micro is where I played them first and foremost. And it sold really well, actually, when it started, the Acorn Electron. It was really, really popular. But it kind of quickly fell under the foot of the mighty Spectrum and C64, which kind of dominated, as I said earlier, actually, the shelf space and the time and the games. People just kept making games for it, and that's what sells systems when everything's on there. And in some ways, there was just too many cuts for the Electron. It was very hard to get the best out of it. So even though you could run BBC Micro titles, natively, you could just load it and it would work because it was kind of relatively the same. It was compatible to an extent. Not everything would work. Many games would, and that was the problem. Some games just couldn't work because of the hardware differences between the two. So in 1985, I actually got one. That's when I got mine because a friend, an older friend of my brother's, lost interest in it. Kind of gave him computers entirely. Felt a bit despondent with it, and I think he went off and did some weird soul searching stuff and went abroad. He kind of gave me it, or us it, and I lost my game, which was great. And then obviously music, big part of my life, certainly has been, always has been. So this month, Spandau Ballet were kept off #1 with Gold, that classic song. Wham were going Club Tropicana. Depeche Mode, the best band in the world, were there with Everything Counts, one of their biggest songs. And effectively we had loads and loads and loads of great songs back then. UB40's Red Red Wine, which is still an anthem now. If you go out drinking, that's the song you want to be listening to. And if movies were your thing, as mine were, still are to an extent, you got to sit in the cinema one last time, as I did, to see the Skywalker trilogy end in Return of the Jedi and answer the biggest question we had been arguing about at school since Empire launched. Was Darth Vader telling the truth? Well, as we found out, he was indeed. The sequels were rife, actually, back then, with the third and largely terrible releases of both Superman in its third entry and Jaws 3D, and both of them I saw at the flicks, and neither of them were worth going. The exceptional Life of Brian was, though, and remains, in my opinion, a comedy classic, a genius film from the Python Squad. That came out this year. And Sean Connery returned one last time. Yes, Sean Connery, Miss Moneypenny. And the only year that two Bond films hit the cinema at the same time. And they actually went head-to-head with the eyebrows that could do it all, Roger Moore, and Octopussy versus Never Say Never Again. Both were great films, but Octopussy, I think, won out in the box office battle. And finally, keeping it gaming related, or at least computer related, the seminal War Games was an inspiration to us youth at the time, as it recognised the micro and online future incoming, albeit with a modem and using all those tricks to get free phone calls from telephone boxes, as we used to do back then. There was a few more than the one shown in this film. And it's, for me and mine, one of Broderick's and certainly director John Badham's best movies. John Badham's a very underrated director, absolutely talented guy. His Dracula film, in fact, is incredible, one of my favourites. With Chris Sarandon in it. It's not Chris Sarandon.
Frank Langella and Eddie Shoestring. Great film. Great soundtrack from John Williams. Classic score in that film. So moving to the next stage, the final one, Patreon, and any questions you might want to send me. I've only got one question this month, so please do send me whatever you can. If you want to ask a question about a subject I think I can answer, then please send it across.
Just like I did last time with my What is PBR. And it also helps me focus on new stuff that's pertinent. So you can join me over on my Patreon link in the description on my channel links. Jedi Mind Trick on you. Why don't we see more developers supporting Vulkan? Do you think, from what I can tell anyway, it seems like PC first developers like Larian and IdTech are the ones using it, whereas console ports, console focused developers seem to stick with DirectX exclusively on their PC releases. Yeah, well, I think this all comes down to the technical expertise of the teams, which you allude to actually, I think, in your question. And most importantly, though, it's those that have or at least use their own engines. So both Larian and IdTech have their own engine. So supporting dual APIs is led by the technical engine programmers and architects. It's not something that you would do with artists, developers generally. So sound artists, animators, game creators. They can't do that. It's not an option. It's all engine related. And the same is true for Deck 13, as I covered last week in Atlas Fallen. They've got their own Fledge engine, and that supports both DX12 and Vulkan now with that Atlas Fallen title. And Vulkan is actually slightly better. But what we have seen in many studios and teams that are now much lighter on that core engineering knowledge and experience, as I want to say. So the hard coding development skills. Not specifically GPU related either. It's both areas of the fence. It's not just GPU. In fact, it's predominantly CPU and then GPU. Sorry, that's my phone. Yeah, so where was so it's around kind of id and many other studios. They have a lighter core on that engineering knowledge. So now that all of that in kind of game development has been democratized, it's into that democratization phase for game development. And that's like a key business model for large companies. Epic, Unity, among a few others, have built upon that kind of creation engine, rage engine that's happened many moons ago, and it's commercialized that development of games. So this is a product in and of itself. It's effectively a SaaS service. And the consumers here, they happen to be game developers, and they kind of drive the growth of that product by demand, by feeding into that development pool, and then that becomes a PI cycle that the developers then go, okay, this is the feedback we're getting from everyone, this is an area we need to focus on, let's improve. And it's very unlikely they're going to demand API functionality, because fundamentally they've got very easy ways to ship a game on DirectX, be it Xbox, PC or console. And kind of the simplest or most widespread solutions win out. So that's DirectX 11, DirectX 12 support. And it kind of comes out of the box on both of these. And to incorporate Vulkan or even old school OpenGL takes more effort. They do support them. You can run them from the engine. The engine doesn't predominate that you need to use DirectX 11, but it's not as easy. And that's an effort, and the kind of payback on that and the technical chops and access to that source code is needed, which kind of ramps up complexity, cost, risk, and all that kind of good stuff adds on top of the development, which is pointless really for a lot of teams. If you're just making a game, you want to get the game shipped and get it working across whatever target platforms you've got. So the chances of us seeing an Unreal Engine 5 title or a Unity title with Vulkan API, it's not impossible, obviously. There might even be some. Off the top of my head, I can't think of one, but there might even be some. But they're very slim. And in reality, this makes little commercial sense. But for Sony's first-party Linux-targeted software, Switch, and any in-house technology, such as like Night Dive Studios, in fact, I'm currently doing a video on that, and the Quake 2, they use their own Keck engine, or Kex engine, which supports Vulkan. And again, that's largely technology-driven team. And this is where we will continue to see, I think, the use of this kind of simpler DX11, DX12 options rather than Vulkan or even old school OpenGL. And I would assume most Sony teams, in fact, who use their own API, in-house API within Sony, which is rumoured to have been built upon the OpenGL kind of Vulkan-like, streamlined, more efficient API structure over the simpler but less efficient, a bit heavy-handed DirectX. Certainly DirectX 11, DirectX 12 is better, but I think fundamentally DirectX 12 is not quite as good as Vulkan in many areas. Certainly DirectX 11 isn't as good on CPU utilization. That's one of the big areas many moons ago I covered. So I think that's a short answer. It's around the technical skill set, and predominantly it's around where they have full access to source, therefore the engine is completely theirs. That is the most likely case. That's it. We're about an hour. Hopefully not too long, hopefully not too short, and hopefully baby bear for everyone concerned. Remember, I am self-funded, independent, and all that kind of good stuff. If you like what you see here or any of the videos, please like, subscribe, share. Stick a comment down below. Leave your questions over on Patreon if you've got me to answer anything. And fingers crossed, I'll be back very soon with more information. There's lots of bits and bobs coming out over the next few weeks. Lots of stuff in the pipeline at the moment I can't talk about, but fingers crossed you'll enjoy it when it lands. And some stuff coming up, if not today, tomorrow, or very soon. So keep an eye here, keep an eye on IGN, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Come on! Come on!